Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. I am Malcolm Hawker, your host of the CDO Matters podcast. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Mr. Samir Sharma, who is the CEO of datazuum, a data consultancy specializing, but not limited to, but specializing in the area of data strategy. So I'm excited to talk about data strategy today. Anyway, Samir, nice to see you. Thank you for joining the podcast today. Like I said, excited to talk about data strategy. But before we get into the heavy, meaty stuff,
sure.
I know you attended a conference last week, the Big Data Conference in London. Would love some of your high level takeaways from that experience. What are some of the 2 or 3 things that really kind of stuck with you coming out of that conference?
Sure. Well, Malcolm, firstly, thank you for inviting me on. I am privileged and, quite, this is my second podcast in the last 3 weeks and which is quite cool. So thank you for having me on. Anyway, my top takeaways of Big Data London. One is that we can all be back and see each other in the flesh, which is quite an extraordinary thing when you think about what we've had to endure over the last 2.5 years. The other thing I think that I did see is a lot more vendors coming up with a lot more tools. And specifically, I was having a conversation with somebody on Friday evening. Actually, a group of us were out after the conference. And somebody put a word cloud together. And on that,
I believe it was Juan Sequeda.
Juan Sequeda, yes,
yeah. World,
yeah. So we were out on Friday night and discussing the word cloud that he'd put together, and actually the top word on that was build. So interestingly enough, when you walked around a lot of the vendors, it seems that everybody's moved into this sort of build phase, but equally, I think everybody's and the interesting thing is there was no one that actually stated mesh in any of their taglines. So that was another thing that Juan picked up, which was quite interesting too. So I think, for me, I'm very tech agnostic when it comes to data and working with clients and getting their data strategy up and running. But actually what we are seeing is that our clients experience data strategy, obviously from we create it for them. We help them, surface what their use cases are. We put together their sort of future operating models, and we look at things like data architecture and so on. Obviously, at a conceptual level, but what's the immaturity in our organization? So I think one of the things that I see as a parallel is people are moving into that build phase, probably trying to get there quicker, and vendors are pushing for use the tools, but actually, I think still there's a lot of people, if there was a data strategy stage, and there was huge queues getting into that stage. So I think it tells you a couple of things. One, that people are still struggling to embed and even create, in some instances, their data strategies. And I think the execution is not as easy as people thought it was. And just getting a bit of tech and implementing that is probably about 10% of the equation, to be fair. And it will only get you so far. It will, you'll probably get value for a certain amount of time, less than 12 months, perhaps not even that. But if you don't know what to do with, the actual data that you generate, store, you source from external sources, then I think you're still missing out on the point that tech is not fundamentally the final sort of solution for a data strategy. So I think there's that, and I think just the proliferation of a lot more vendors, on the floor space was quite huge. Things I think that the other thing that I think was the trends that we're seeing are data catalogs, data observability. Again, on Juan's list, observability was up there. So I think there's a lot more about how do we build a better ecosystem, thinking about lineage, because as you know, data governance struggles with that. And as you also know, data quality struggles with, things like observability and understanding where the defects are in the process. So I think there's those types of tools that people are moving towards, which I think, again, is a good way, because then we can start to automate some of those tricky and difficult things that we couldn't necessarily do. But I think the ecosystem, the industry is still developing, and I think we're finding so many things day in, day out that will help in terms of tooling. But I equally see that we're still seeing a need for data strategy in the main to really plot out where we're heading and where companies are going in terms of roadmaps and in terms of value generation. That word value is always bandied around, but really, how do they get business results? What is it that they need to latch onto in order to drive increased acquisition, or increasing revenue, optimizing efficiencies and cost savings, and so on. So I think we need to remember that those are the kinds of things that we're all challenged as the data people to do, as data practitioners. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because in Juan's post about the word cloud, which I found fascinating, what he highlighted what he didn't see was a focus on outcomes, aka business value, the things that you were just talking about, which is arguably the other 90% that isn't technology.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Well, you can get into people, process, culture, all those other things, but the point here really is that all about vendors, all about capabilities, all about functionality, all about building. Which for IT people like me sounds fun.
Yeah, great. I
like to build things.
Let's build some stuff and dazzle everybody.
But the lack of the focus there on outcomes potentially is slightly problematic, but not surprising. I mean, we've never really been focused on outcomes that much, I would argue. When I was a Gartner analyst, it was the number one topic of a conversation. The number one driver of program failures, the number one driver of lack of funding, stakeholder support, on and on. It always traced back to value. But
absolutely,
I find the build notion a little curious. How much of that do you think potentially is a function in that so many of the technologies or architectural patterns like the mesh and the fabric, maybe even data virtualization, maybe some of these other technologies, how much of that build do you think is a function of the fact that a lot of what's being sold, you can't actually buy?
Yeah.
Right? Meaning, hey, let's do a mesh. Well, you can't go buy one.
No.
Even Zamak would acknowledge that.
Well, and she did acknowledge that there isn't a specific tooling, and I guess that's why she's now in stealth mode. And possibly,
well, right, to help go solve for that. I would love to talk to her more about this notion of what she calls an operating system for a mesh, which I would argue is only kind of a piece of it.
Correct.
Which I think kind of roughly aligns to perhaps what Gartner would call a data and analytics governance platform. But it's this semantic layer plus quality plus integration plus brains plus graph AI ML. It's the thing that would kind of be the cockpit, as it were. I think that's what she's working on. But you can't buy that.
No, you can't.
And you can't buy a data fabric.
No.
So the people who are pushing a fabric narrative out of Gartner, especially Mark Beyer, who's a friend of mine, a brilliant guy, would tell you can't buy one.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much of the notion of kind of build is very much a function of, hey, look at all this cool stuff you can do, but you can't buy it, so you're going to have to build it.
Do I think that's always been the case, though, hasn't it?
True.
You know, we've always been in the moment of, hey, let's do a data program. Whoa, okay, let's go see what tooling's out there. But not asking the why question. Why are we doing it? For what reason? Who's going to benefit? The how is fine, but actually ask those questions up front. And I think, when I look at it, technology is easier than having to put together a notion of, guys scratching heads. What are we going to do here? And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, I literally was saying, I think, this is just another iteration of the whole marketing movement for tooling. So, and it will morph, because maybe we had virtualization, and then we had node computing, and we had all of these various different terms that we were attempting to implement, SOA, and all of those areas which are trying to improve how we work. But simply, if you look back at it, why have we got all of this stuff? Because the systems can't integrate. They're not very good at doing that. We've layered on, corporations have layered on so much on top of it that they never started with a data focused view. And when I say data focused view, I say, okay, we're going to implement a CRM system, or we're going to implement an ERP. How do we get our data model sorted before we actually implement these things? And why do we need to be forced into adopting the data model from a software program? So there's those types, so build out what we always say is build out your business data model, and then start to layer in what you need to on top of that. But come from a sort of view of the business architecture, as opposed to fundamentally, going straight for data architecture and, buying, a platform and hoping that, it's going to give us some value. So I think all of those things, and look, we've gone through so many iterations, from the data warehouse to the data lake to the data lake house, now the data mesh, centralization to decentralization, and it's just like someone's constantly going around a roundabout, and just coming back to their own tail, and they keep doing that. So I do see some principles that are good, in the fabric or the mesh, or equally I think they're just an evolution because of the such tools like Hadoop, which were very difficult to use, and a lot of people put Hadoop in as a data strategy, and that didn't necessarily work. So I think we've got to move away from one thing as well. Most people will put together a data strategy, but when I've gone in to review the data strategy that somebody has created, either with an external company or whatever, it's more a technical data strategy. And that's the bit which I think is it's not necessarily wrong, but they're missing that whole bit, which is, hey, okay, we can put the plumbing in, we can, get a platform, we can do that. But actually, what are the things that the business needs? And maybe that's the bit which domain specific. You can understand a little bit more about what the domains require. And I also equally think that, the decentralization and getting governance closer to the lines of business actually is probably a good thing. And not having this huge, big central team with policies and, hitting you over the head if you don't do something. But actually, if we can build in with, the current tooling that there might be available, things like observability, things like lineage, well, that's going to help, isn't it? And then you can put your policies, sprinkle those privacy policies, but, as near enough to the business as we can. And I think we also need to sort out the age-old problems of ownership and stuff like that.
Oy.
Maybe that's another, that oi.
well, I've made a few videos about this, stuck a few out on LinkedIn. Actually, even wrote a research piece at Gartner about ownership. I think I called it "Who Owns Master Data?" Right. And I think it's okay to talk about ownership from the perspective of an individual application. Mm-hmm. But when you start talking about domains that are used everywhere, it's a horrible label. Right? Because ownership of what? Yes. Right? Like ownership of the creation. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe. Ownership of the governance policies that define the rules around create and updating and reading and security, archival, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, probably not, because a lot of people are going to have a say in how customer data is retained or defined or modeled, particularly at higher levels of the organization. Sure. So, to me, the notion of ownership, I know that, like, if we applied like a DAMA, however you want to say it, model, it's all about ownership. But for not all data is created equally, right? And I think the notion of ownership is a bit misguided. But I want to drill. What do you think?
I mean, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Well,
Well, it isn't. It isn't, right? I think if you talk to kind of people who live and breathe in governance, like the notion of ownership, oh yeah, it's critical. You have to define your data.
No. I'm not saying it's. I'm saying there's probably different ways to do it. And I think the other thing is what things like the mesh attempts to do is to say, well, actually, let's have a data product owner. And now we've gone down to a level which is a data product owner, and therefore, and Zermatt defines data products as a pure data set, on a node, and that's what you're basically managing and you're responsible for. So, but some people will actually say a data product is more than that. A data product is the output of an algorithm. A data product could be something like a dashboard. A data product, could be a data set. And equally, all of these will have different types of value streams associated with them. So I think we've got to even get down to what the definition of a data product is, possibly. But if you read Zermatt's book, it's a data set, and it's owned by an individual data product owner in the domain. And, hence the reason that you go down to the domain specific level. They're able then to think about more data sharing parameters with others, which I think is a decent thing. I think we should be data sharing across internal parts of organizations. It's clear that other data sets will be useful to someone else. And I'm not saying for any moment am I saying that there shouldn't be perhaps a very thin veneer of central data governance that will oversee policies and certain types of procedures, but it doesn't necessarily need a big machine and a massive program that goes on for years and years. So I think we do have to think differently in some ways. And I'm not, it might not be the mesh, it might not be Fabric, it might be, I don't know, it might even go back to the data warehouse, probably not, but it's worked. But there are different ways of doing it, and I think we need to. The age-old conversation about data modeling now as well has popped up its head above the parapet. So, now we're talking about that. So I think we need to. We certainly need to discuss these things, and not saying that as you said earlier, there is no way that we can have a pure mesh right now. Absolutely not.
Or maybe we could, right? Like you could have a hyper federated environment where individual data products could be truly owned. Meaning I define the policies, I define the model, I define the business rules, I'm the product owner, I define the business case, I define how it's packaged, go to market, the training related to it. I'm responsible for the literacy of my data product and how people are using it. You could do, in theory,
you can do that.
But then we're back to you're essentially completely breaking the benefits of centralization in any form.
And I think this is where we have to look at the maturity of an organization, right?
Couldn't agree more.
I don't think we are, many organizations out there are not ready for any of this new wave of thinking. They're just not. And you know that. And I think lots of people know that. So there's definitely an acceptance of, hey, are we mature enough to put a mesh or a Fabric? Probably not. Maybe if we've got lots of tooling and maybe the Fabric can be, essentially molded, which I guess is a mesh anyway, but I'll probably get thrown out with the bathwater for saying that.
There's some pearl clutching going on.
Yeah, right exactly. Of course. And you know what? Is a Fabric like a mesh? Is a mesh like a Fabric? Well,
tomato.
Yeah, exactly. So let's not get down to those levels. But I think it's I think it's important for organizations to understand that maturity and not jump on everything that they can really think of implementing, from out there in the tech landscape. Because number one, there's nothing wrong with a hub and spoke model. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think maturity comes with, let's phase our way through the types of operating models we want to have. Sometimes actually, if it's a greenfield site, or if it's there's a difficulty with perhaps a lot of legacy systems, maybe centralization is good to begin with. I don't know. And again, if there's no data team, if there's no real, some companies do have, very lack of resources or skills that can actually help them to build out these kinds of structures. So dependent on maturity, dependent where they are, dependent on the types of capabilities and skills, dependent on the operating model, there could be there could be benefits of decentralization completely.
So what do you recommend? You're at the table with a client CDO or maybe a CIO, and you've done a little bit of recon from the perspective of understanding the operating model, understanding the existing culture, understanding the existing maturity levels around governance and data management.
Yes.
And what you find is a gap between where they say they want to go from a strategy perspective. We want to be, way, we want to drive a Ferrari, as it were, from a strategy perspective. But what they've got is a broken down Honda. Across operating models, across maturity levels. What do you recommend there? How do you go from A to, from 60 kilometers an hour to 300?
So there is a mechanism of doing that. So, when we do look, as you've said, in the preamble, absolutely, we know where they are, we know what they want to do, where they want to get to, and there's a massive gap. So I think when we start to speak to the data teams, we look at the operating models and we assess capabilities and skills, because that's important. You can't just say, right, we're going to start putting data scientists down into the lines of business. That doesn't make sense, right? So there's got to be a certain amount of standardization that you need. There's got to be a certain amount of proof of value, there's that term again, that you can start to show stakeholders who are going to invest in this thing long term. So I think that's one thing that many people forget. Before you go out and start thinking about, centralization versus decentralization, or, a factory model, or whatever you might want to have, you got to think about, right, okay, we know that there's the use cases that are important. We know that they're attached up to the business strategy and the levers that the CEO needs to basically work on in order to drive that over, maybe in the interim, but really horizon scanning 3 to 5 years, even longer in some cases. So we want to prove value, and we want to spin up and say, this is how we can do it. And we want to show that early benefit to stakeholders. Now, actually, one of the companies we're working with, we have decided not to embed a sort of centralized team right now. They've got policies, procedures, and so on. They actually had they're still going through the iteration of their data governance program. And we came in after 2 years when they started to do that. But what we're actually doing is spinning up something called virtual squads for them. And they've got a use case and they've got capabilities, but those capabilities are in particular teams around the organization. And essentially, we work around that purpose, which is the use case, delivering that out to a bunch of stakeholders who are actually a part of that squad or commando team or whatever we want to call it. And they come together for a certain period of time. You test the parameters, you test how that works. And what you're doing is you're testing how you can actually start to drive out people coming together. And essentially, we may at the end of it fix the resource and say, now we need to actually have a bunch of people that come together around use cases, almost like domain specific. But essentially we're just testing it. So we want to see if it works and it stands up within the processes that we're going to embed, the procedures that we're going to lay out, and the ways of working and the engagement frameworks. So one of the things we also find is that the gaps between business and data and IT teams is normally about engagement. How do we speak to each other? How do we work with each other? How do we start to communicate our own set of values in terms of cultural values? And how do we start to then talk about data at a base level and what we need to get and drive out of that, and why the marketing department needs X and they need to drive that out. But again, we pin it up to what the CEO wants to drive out and the C-suite are looking at, and the board are driving out for revenue and so on and so forth. So I think building that and testing it is the first iteration that you need to do. You can't go all in and say, right, we're going from zero and we're going to implement a hub and spoke model outright, because you still need some stability from a center. And maybe you might start from the central area. And then you need to think about how do we start sort of move down to those spokes and start to have the dotted line and working with those. So I think there's got to be a testing phase, a proofing phase, a real understanding of how much agility there is in the organization to move, because we know that they're immature, because we know that they don't know perhaps how these teams come together, and culturally they're all very different. So how do we aspire to one purpose? How do we move those teams to really embedding certain principles? And how do we just talk about business, in business language and not in technical or data language, or, but actually we're all on the same page. So coming together with a virtual view of it, testing that, proving it, and then saying, right, it works. These are the things. There were some kinks. There were things we need to iron out, but essentially we know it can work and operate. And then we can start to roll that out. So I don't think there's even if you're going into an organization where they've got very mature data people who have got all the tools and have got all the access to data and so on, it's not always so clear that they've got the right perception within the business, and within the lines of business and communication, and how do they set up, ways of working together, which sounds strange, but still, engagement is a massive thing. And I think that's the cultural aspect, which everybody raves on about data culture, which I don't fully agree with. I think more so there is a cultural fabric which needs to be worked in and operated in. So, to cut it short, I've gone on a bit too long, but I think it exists on, there are many operating models, there are many ways of testing it, but I think you've got to work through what is the best option at that point in time for that organization. You've got an area to get to, you've got the view of the world, and that future state, but you can't jump to it immediately. So you need to have phased views of that. And sometimes having a centralized, or, like we're doing, spinning up these virtual squads, or literally, in some cases, some organizations do have analysts in their lines of business who are not really aligned to the data folks. So maybe it's just getting standards and, making sure that they understand what's possible and what's not, and how to onboard data, and, how to integrate it into their tooling and so on. And then start to maybe work backwards to say, how do we need to start to embed the right principles? So there's different ways of doing it. There's never one way of operating with a company, which I'm sure you've seen that.
Oh, indeed. So a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
And I want to circle back to the culture discussion, because I think that's important. But there's a few things that I just want to tie off on that I really love, by the way. One, it's refreshing to hear a strategy consultant talk about implementation. Mm-hmm. In my personal experience, I've had a lot of frustration with, okay, here's your strategy, bye.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
There's history behind that as well. Right? I'll tell you that in a minute.
Good luck with the implementation. Where it is one type of consultancy to do the strategy that is, generally runs from $500 to $700 an hour ish. Yeah. And another type of consultancy to actually start putting shovels in the ground, which generally costs a little bit less than that. And it's refreshing to hear a business model from a data strategy perspective that is traversing both worlds. So that to me is refreshing and comforting. That's one thing that I heard you say. Another thing is, I'm just paraphrasing here, but is really kind of be agile, be pragmatic. I think I heard pragmatism for sure.
And I will always talk about pragmatism, because I don't, sometimes I will advocate for being agile, but I think there's another word that I use, which is probably the word agility. Right. Have agility, have flexibility in the way that you operate, test things, learn, and then be able to move in a nimble fashion. Don't be wedded to a particular process for years and then realize that it doesn't work, because then you've just wasted so much money. You've come to a conclusion that you could have come to way earlier. And the CEO is looking, or whoever it is that your sponsor is looking at you and saying, how much money have you, costed me now? So that's a tough gig. So
big A agile versus little a
yeah,
agile,
yeah.
or agility, because let's not be confused here that if I say agile, I mean like big A,
Okay.
where you've got all of a sudden everything is expressed in user stories, and you have sprint meetings, and you have have
more boards
scoring
than
of
one can
stories.
imagine.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly. That may be a part of it, maybe
yeah,
to a certain degree,
yeah.
but I think that's a better way to express it. Agility, pragmatism, and agility, and
Yes.
learn, respond, adapt.
Yes.
Right. So I certainly heard that. I heard about making incremental process, right,
Yes.
which ties back to agility. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't go for the big bang.
Yep.
What I heard you say is focus on specific use cases,
Yep.
right? Move the needle from a use case perspective.
Yep.
So getting to the notion of culture, you said you're not a big believer in that. I want to drill down a little bit, because what I think I'm hearing you say is that culture can be molded and adapted through results. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. Most organizations have a culture. They have a set of values. They operate within a particular context. Yeah. They have a particular set of ways of working. Yeah. They will often have, we're collaborative, we're cooperative, or we have a set of values, etc. So we already have that fabric that exists, and on each of those cues, on each of those levels, we have lines of business. And one of the lines of business is data. Let's just say that that's true, right? That it could be, in some cases, it could be a shared service, it could be a particular just another line of business, a profit center, it could be a cost center in some cases. So anyway, it's a line of business, right? So and that line of business works within the cultural context. And I think what's happened over time is, through several new fads that have occurred over the years, things like data democratization, and the elements of some of the early ideas around big data and decentralization as well in some cases, is that people have been given stuff without really being told why. Yeah. So
here's your data.
Yeah. And so that's it, right? Democratize your data. I mean, BI was all about that, right? Democratize it. Give everybody, everybody's going to be
into Tableau.
Yeah, exactly. And then what they do is they look at it and they, build something because they've maybe gone to one or two sessions, but do they need to? And then they download it in Excel and they're comfortable back in Excel. Okay. So I mean, that was, in my view, that's why we've now got this big issue of data literacy, right? Because the tool sets have created that. The democratization has created that. A lot of the push in the industry has been to, talk about visualization as if, you switch it on and I literally can start building charts. Well, it's not always the case. Yeah. And not everybody needs to do that. So I think those have attributed to this issue and this idea of data culture. So I think, as the line of business, just like all other lines of business, they have they are enabled to do certain things for the organization, and therefore it's incumbent on the data professionals, practitioners, and the teams to work with everybody, to work with the business, the other lines of business. What do they want? They have to work with the IT, because that's another line of business that they have to cooperate with. So everybody in the organization needs to cooperate with each other. This is how organizations are designed. There is an organizational underpinning. There's an organizational psychology that is actually the way that these lines of business and the sort of ecosystem, they work together. They live and breathe. Yeah. So my view about culture is really, there is one. We don't need to disrupt it. What we need to do is get better at engaging with each other. We need to set a foundation of ways of working that will use business language, and be able to talk to somebody in the outcomes that they are looking for, rather than saying, presenting, for example, the output of an algorithm in in a very raw format, talking about outliers and this and that, and specifically going into, how they trained it. Does a business person really want to hear that? No, the business person wants to know, what is the decision I'm going to make, with this output, and can you tell me that? And can I then take the action that I need to in order to drive my marketing campaign for more acquisition, or re-engineering my processes because I need to do that and get more efficient in that. So I think that is one part of it. And I think also, as data people, we're not really good at looking at process. And I say that because I've seen it in so many conditions where, if you look at a set of use cases, and I'm, walking into an organization where they say, right, we need to deliver these things. And you've got this wonderful documentation laid out, not all the time, but if you have sort of documentation laid out, then, the first question I ask is, okay, you want to do this, but what's the underpinning business process that drives this? And then when that question's put out on the table, everybody kind of looks at each other and says, well, that's the business concern. Well, no, it's not actually,
right.
So I think that's the bit which we need to get better at. And therefore, is it the illiterate part of that data? No, I think it's really just, getting people involved with each other, learning more about, the principles that we work through. And, the reasons I'm very passionate about this, because I've seen people shouting at each other in meetings because they're not speaking on the same sort of wavelength, and just bringing it down to, look, what is it you want to do? Why do you want to do it? Who do you want to do it for? And then being able to say, right, and finally, when we get to the solution, this is how we're going to do it. I don't need to know technical components, I don't, but really, I need to understand at every point where I'm going to be needed, how I'm going to be testing that, what I need to learn about the output. Maybe you're going to test it and say, this doesn't work as a hypothesis, but, I think there's, ways of working. And, what we did was to build something called the data strategy canvas, which actually helps to have that conversation with each other. Both from, and I just talk about the triangle of, the sort of IT, data, and business teams. And it's just a meaningful conversation focused around business objectives, rather than it being, around technical objectives.
Well, and this sounds mostly for a data team or an IT team, this sounds more like a listening exercise than a training exercise.
Yes.
And where I'm kind of going with this is this notion of literacy. And I really dislike that term.
Yes. Yes. Same here. And I saw you wince at one moment. At one point.
It's the literacy term, right?
Yeah.
Because what we're building here, this is not rocket science.
No.
Right.
No.
So, I'm sorry, data folks. It's just not. We are trying to provide data or systems or processes or tools that help fuel better decision making, and that provide insights that can reduce supplier costs or increase customer experience.
Correct.
And we're not building rockets. So if you're listening and you are able to translate what you're hearing into actionable, valuable solutions, then the literacy required should be marginal. Right?
Yes, I agree.
I agree. There should be like some instruction booklet. Sure, you could have a maybe some glossaries or some other things, but if we have to embark, I'm getting a little philosophical here, but if we have to embark literally on a program, which for some companies could be a multi-million-dollar program of this top down, I'm going to make you more data literate initiative, then I think something else must be broken.
I think so. I think so, and I think it's I think you're right. Let's.
I'm right.
I think you're right. There are many things broken. And again, it does go back to how we work with each other, and you're right around the philosophical questions that you're asking. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I think we've got to be pragmatic now. We've got to sort of say, hey guys, look, this has gone on long enough, and is the well going to dry up? Is the sponsor or the CEO going to say enough is enough? And then we've been there before, so and so I think we've got to really think about how much we drive out capability wise, but equally, as we talked about before, driving those outcomes, driving those results, whether we can attribute, to the overall objectives of maybe improving revenue by 5%. I mean, one of our clients, when we started to work with them, they gave us an overall view of what they needed to do: double margin in 10 years, increase revenues by 5% in 6 years. An American client, and there's certain things about culture which they hadn't got right yet, and I think it was more about DEI and diversity and so on. But when we started talking to them, we said, look, one of the things that we'd really like to do is to break your business down into its business data model. And that actually really got them interested, and it got the business people interested. It got the lines of business really interested, because they said, that's interesting. No one's ever sort of come at it like that. And, I'm not saying we're the only people who do that. There's lots of people who do it. So what I'm saying though, is that they had been through so many iterations, so many consultancies had come in and built stuff and delivered it, and it wasn't being used. But it was really going back to the fundamentals, right? How do we build out how do we cater for your business? It's the context that it's working in, the environment, the marketplace, the political sphere, the regulatory aspect, and so on. How do we start to get all of that stuff included, so we're building your business data model as things, as a foundation, but as things move, as markets change, as political regulation is enforced, how do we then have that agility? And again, it's about that, and then you can have those conversations at a lower level around the data product and the owner and the business process owner, and is the business process owner the person that actually does along that business process end to end, own that and the data in it. There's lots of different conversations that you can have. So I think it's important for us to think about that, to design a business that is going to operate within the context of data. So we're architecting the business with data, which is the way I think is perhaps a better way to say it, instead of talking data models. But anyway,
in my experience, anytime you ask the business to fundamentally change, whether that is culture, whether that's technology, whether that's process, if you as a data leader are asking to do that, you have increased your risk tenfold in your ability to actually drive value, versus what I heard you say, which is kind of deal with play with the cards that you've been dealt to a certain degree, right? And make incremental changes, do what you can within the environment that you've been given, do what you can with the technology, maybe even processes, existing governance rules, and make slow incremental changes. I love it. So we went from at the beginning of the conversation to talk about kind of technology leading and technology driving to now to more of a perspective of the outcomes driving, what you're trying to achieve driving, and making incremental process from where you are to where you want to be. I love it. Samir Sharma, this has been a fantastic conversation. I know we could keep going for hours.
I know we could. I know.
And we need to absolutely positively meet at a conference someday, sometime in the future. Preferably over a pint. We do want to note you are the host of the Data Strategy Show. So
yes, I am.
Most certainly check out Samir's podcast on
you.
your podcast provider of choice. And I know that there will be a fantastic episode upcoming that is hosting, that is featuring yours truly here.
Yes, there will be.
Wanted to
fantastic. Of course it will be.
Yes, brilliant. But again, Samir, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Thank you for everybody tuning in today to CDO Matters, and look for another episode shortly. Thanks again.
Thanks, Malcolm. Bye-bye.